So I know what it means to feel anxious about starting to talk. I know how it is to be uncomfortable with your own pronunciation. I also know how it is to feel defeated and powerless in front of a vocabulary list that you're convinced you will never be able to say or to learn. So all those things are things that I experienced myself. And as a researcher, as a teacher, it helps me a lot, of course, to have this experience. And the fact that I've been, so I when I was 17, I took a couple of weeks and I've been at school in Finland. When I was 18, I took a year off and I went to school in Spain. And when I was 23, I moved to the Netherlands and experienced the school system there. It's still Europe. It's still the European Union. And still I saw the major differences between those systems. And so I took a bit what I liked in every system and I try to help teachers right now to improve the situation. Also to improve school for learners that are a bit atypical, so that have ADHD or dyslexic or don't feel like school is talking to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very interesting in the theory I work with, the dynamic usage-based theory, because it's a theory that takes into account individual trajectories. So that's what I've been learning from my previous experiences as a language learner. Yeah. And as a learner.
Yeah, I think that's sometimes overlooked, especially by scholars, right? The importance of personal practical knowledge in, what guides our craft or determines our day-to-day practice with our students. And I think it's beautiful that, hearing that from a scholar that's, giving equal weight almost, maybe even more weight to this idea of our own personal practical experiences as learners, as observers in the classroom. So I think that's beautiful.
I was going to ask you, because you said that you also think like a scientist, and I think it's important because you in a way you're playing in both worlds. You are in the classroom, but you're also doing research. And Mike likes to call this the term is a scholar practitioner, which is kind of what we try to embody as well. And there's a quote by Adam Grant. I can't remember which book. I think it was called Think Again. And he talks a lot about this idea of thinking like a scientist. And I remember his quote. He says, thinking like a scientist means you don't let your ideas become your identity. And I think the question I have for you, Audrey, and as a teacher, how do you ensure that you don't let ideas that you have, hypotheses that you have about language become part of your identity, become somewhat solidified to the point where you just don't change? You've been doing this because we know this. We know that there are a lot of practitioners, teachers who have been teaching the same way for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And they say they have 30 years of experience, but in reality, they don't, because they've been doing the same thing for so long. So how do you maintain or keep this scientist hat on, or this scientist mindset on, when you are in the classroom?
Yeah, I'm very privileged because I am a scientist that I have paid time to read stuff, to go to conferences, be up to date to the latest findings about how our brain works, what people have found. And it's not the daily life of most teachers in high schools or in schools. They have a big teaching load, and in a way, it's what I try to avoid, but it's what I see is becoming. School is becoming yet another factory, the factory of knowledge, of learning. Those teachers have to rely on textbooks that have been published by publishers who, most of them, are not linguists. And so they don't have enough time to really reflect, think, create. So I find myself very privileged in a way because I do have that time. And what is important, in fact, is to continue to develop yourself as a professional. So professionalization is something you ask from a doctor, from a dentist, anyone whose field is in movement, in motion. And it would be very wrong to think that teaching is not in motion. What we know now about how our brain is wired and how we learn things and how our emotions play a role in that is precious and should be known, right, and considered by teachers. So with my colleague Wim Gombert and my other colleague Yannis Brain, we have a company now called Project France, and that's what we do. We give a course to teachers that are already in practice, and we teach them how to teach in another way. Change is a very difficult thing to achieve in education.
Yes.
Change takes a lot of time because there are a lot of stakeholders as well. A lot of stakeholders who have power know not much about learning or education, or not enough, in fact. And so my experience until now is that if you want to be an actor of change, you have to change bottom up. And it takes almost one teacher at a time for the moment. And so we've accepted that and we try to do that. But it works like it has a very strong effect, because sometimes some teachers, they've been practicing what they learned in schools, maybe in 1980s, 1990s. And these were other theories, other thoughts on what language actually is. And so it has worked for them for a while, because you can learn languages in so many different ways. It depends what your learning objectives are. Right. What do you want to achieve? Is it communication you want to achieve? Is it accuracy? So for a long time, it has been working for them. They had maybe more hours during the week to teach languages. So then, you need less to maximize the exposure that learners need. But nowadays, you have to do a lot with not a lot, with a couple of hours. And so if you want to create change, you need to take time to really get inspired and get that knowledge. I use articles. There are now blurbs or articles in a website called Oasis, which is a website for teachers where research findings or written in a language that is easy to understand for people that are non-scientists. I listen to podcasts, but also create those networks of teachers and networks where teachers are in contact with researchers and where they can exchange. Because researchers learn also a lot from the teachers about the constraints of the practice. So I work a lot in high school, so most of my examples will be about this age group between 12 years old and 18 years old. The constraints you have with them is not only that you have to teach them a language. In fact, you have to push them to do something they don't want to do, but you have to make it in a way that they are happy to do it.
Yes. Engagement. We talked to Sarah Mercer recently, and she said that engagement is the Goldilocks of language education.
Right. And as a teacher, you have to be a magician in that, to create that engagement for a group of people in an age where they are preoccupied by so many different things and so insecure about themselves.
It's funny because there's also, I think, the reason why it's so difficult for us to change our practice and for us to change the way languages are taught is because there's also a little bit of habit inertia. I think we've been doing the same thing for so long that it's just so hard for people to start looking at language from a different perspective, to start thinking about teaching from a different perspective. But I think we have come a long way. I think COVID in a way has sped up that process. And I feel like we're coming. I think teachers are slowly coming to the realization that the nature of language is very different from other subjects like history, math, geography. And that we shouldn't be teaching languages like those things. As you said, like it's not a factory of learning or of learners, right? Where you're just regurgitating one grammatical rule at a time, which brings me to a very important question. A lot of your research has focused on this AIM. I think that's or is it AIM? I don't know if they pronounce the acronym as AIM.
Yes,
Yeah,
they
AIM.
say aim.
AIM. So
And
it's
in French, a lot of people say IEM.
IEM. AIM. Okay, we'll go with AIM.
Aim.
So I was wondering if you could perhaps elaborate more on what AIM is. I think it's like the accelerator or accelerative integrated method. So what is
Right.
exactly AIM? What does it mean
Aim,
for language teaching? And how is that different from what we were just talking about, these traditional methods of instruction?
Mm-hmm.
AIM is a method created by Wendy Maxwell. She's a Canadian teacher
I've
of
never
French.
heard of her. This is the thing.
In
Like
Ontario.
in
She's in
Ontario, right?
Ontario.
Which is, yeah, we never. Have you heard of AIM, Mike, before?
No.
Yeah.
No.
I don't think a lot of people know, but yeah, continue.
Right. And she was a primary school teacher, and for a long time very frustrated by the fact that the pupils in her class were learning French so many hours a week, but at the end of the journey they couldn't say a word. And
Not surprised.
right.
Was
and
I one of her
it's a
students?
frustration.
Yeah.
Many teachers know this frustration. So she had the feeling she was failing, really, and decided to create something new. She's a very creative person. And she did a master's degree, and her supervisor for a thesis was Jim Cummins.
Oh.
And so what she did is that she took, in fact, many theories and approaches that we already knew in the literature. So there is some storytelling, some total physical response. There is quite a lot of the direct method as well. She combined many things that existed already, but she did it in a way that would be suited for the age group of our learners. So it's the method that you can use when you start from the very beginning a language, and that provides a lot of exposure. It's a target only method, so you only talk the target language from day one.
So there's no code switching. You're not going back and forth between languages.
So when I calculated in the classrooms how much French was used, it was close to 90%.
Oh wow!
There are moments where you use the another language to introduce a new concept, or when you do comprehension checks. So you want to be sure that they understood that combination of words or whatever. So there are moments where another language can be used, but it's very restricted. And because, of course, when you create this immersion environment in a classroom, your learners will be completely immersed in the new language they don't understand. It's good to have some help. And she uses gestures to, in a way, make herself clear from day one what she means, but also to help the learners to entrench what they've been learning.
Okay.
So there is one gesture for one word. And she uses stories.
And can I just ask a quick question? Because you just touched on it briefly. You mentioned that a lot of her work was with like what some might consider very young learners. And it sounds like you're working with secondary students or high school students. So is this an approach that is more commonly found in like younger learner contexts, or just to help kind of contextualize the listener a little bit? Or has this approach been used in other contexts as well? Do you know?
So for now, it has been used in primary schools and high schools. And I know that she has been working, and it should be out now, on stories for migrant learners. So people who come from an immigration background and have to learn the language at a later age, so for adults. And I hear also, so because if I tell you a bit how it looks like, so you have stories that you tell to the learners, and the learners repeat the story, and they do a lot of activities around the story. There's a lot of art and music in the method as well, because it's based on repeating a lot, repetition of combination of words. And repetition can be boring.
Yes.
So if you don't want it to be boring, you have to vary a lot in the activities, the configuration you do those activities in. And you need a goal that is fun and motivating. And the goal is to play the little story as a theater, as a play in front of the parents. That's their goal.
So there's a performance. So there's a performance.
There is a performance at the moment. Yeah.
There's like
there
a
is
little bit of
performance.
pushed output there, right? Like where they're kind of thrown into it a little bit. Yeah, interesting.
What's interesting as well is that so every 10 minutes you change the activity, but the first activity is always the routines with a gesture where students have to repeat the little sentences, etc. And that's interesting in many different aspects. But it's also interesting because when you start a language and you're a bit self-conscious about how you speak it, we know that use is very important when you learn a language. You can do it in a choir. And so when you do it in a choir, you're not on the spot.
Right.
Nobody really hears you. So you have the space and the time to practice and say, repeat things as you wish and entrench what you're learning. So that's a very interesting part of the method. Another very interesting part is that this first 6 months is dedicated to oral skill.
Okay.
You don't write. You don't read. You just do speaking. You speak.
You're basically processing all the input that you receive, and then you eventually are able to produce. So it's very much like how we learn our first language in a way. You don't have to.
Very much.
Yeah. I actually just went on the website here, and it says she says here, one of the strategies includes linguistic reinforcement through pleasant repetition. What is this?
Right, yes, but she's aware of that.
Yeah, what's this pleasant repetition? So is it repetition of phrases? Is it repetition of words? Is it repetition of communicative functions? What are the learners? So you said stories. So they're basically telling stories? Is that what it is?
The teacher tells them a story, the Three Little Pigs or a story. And the learners, they learn the story, the sentences of the stories. In fact, what they learn are routines, combination of words, what in the usage-based theory you would call a construction, or you would call a form meaning mapping. So it's actually words in combinations that you learn in the form of a routine. Pleasant means that she varies a lot in the way they repeat it. So it's not repetition as such. You can call it iteration because, in fact, you repeat it, but slightly differently. So what you take in is also slightly different.
Can you give me an example? Like I'm having a hard time visualizing that. Like, what would be an example of that? Like, because you said they're doing this repetition in different ways. Does that change like, are you changing your tone? Are you changing your intonation when you repeat those words? Is that what it is?
You could, but you could. An example would be that you have to repeat a question and an answer. For example, où est-ce que le petit cochon court? Le petit cochon court vers la maison de bois, for example. You could think in a classroom of 2 circles of learners, one inside, one outside, and they have to answer the question, but every time to another person, and the circle changes like this.
Okay.
So it has a purpose to say it again, because you don't say it to the same person.
Right.
It's meaningful. Meaningfulness is a key word also in usage-based approaches, and AIM fits really in that umbrella of usage-based approaches.
So they are repeating a language that has some sort of communicative value. They're not just repeating, for example, the book is on the table.
No, that's also a work that she has been doing. She created something called pared down language, which is a set of 700 words, more or less, that are highly frequent and highly meaningful when you want to talk about your life as a learner. And usually they are in a classroom, so that they need to say things about the environment and also simple things. If you want communication to be in the target language from day one, they need the tools to do that as well.
Yeah.
So this pared down language is what she uses to write those stories.
I'm actually reading another thing you said here, Audrey. She said, and I guess this is my assumption, so please correct me if I'm mistaken. She said, you work from the whole to the part as opposed from the part to the whole, which my interpretation of this is traditional language instruction. We go from parts to the whole. So we teach students words, and then we teach them grammatical structures, and then we expect them to communicate. In this one, you start with the whole, and then you break it down, and then you're showing them how to produce those parts that comprise the whole. Is that it? It's almost very much like task-based language teaching, where you're communicating the whole message, and then you can kind of go back and work on parts of it that needed more, some sort of fine-tuning. Is that a correct interpretation of this?
Yeah, so you see language as holistic, has units of words in combination that are later analyzed. But at first, they are learned as a chunk, as a whole.
Yeah.
And research in usage-based approaches and dynamic usage-based approaches see language as those constructions, because language speakers, when they speak with each other, it's not random how they say things. Actually, most of things we say, all the things we say, are said exactly the same way by people around us. So we co-create and co-adapt a lot of our language, and the words are rarely in isolation. A verb in French goes together with a preposition, and it's quite random which preposition it is sometimes. But still, it's the conventionalized ways of saying something. So what she exposes learners to, all those conventionalized ways of saying things.